Hello, this is Domenico again with Easynomics, and we're going to be looking at calculating areas within a subsidy graph for the new IB syllabus. Using the example from the previous subsidy video, looking at the market for corn in the United States, we want to remember that this is an input market, and with input markets, we know that the PED, the price elasticity of demand, is inelastic. Demand is coming from food manufacturers that have no close substitute for the input that they are demanding, in this case corn. And then the price elasticity of supply due to length of time is also inelastic. So although the curves don't illustrate very vertical supply and demand curves, we want to remember that. We want to keep that in mind. So let's go ahead and do some calculations. First, we want to calculate equilibriums in the free market. All right, we want to be able to recognize certain things within the free market. So one, they might ask you, what is the price equilibrium within the free market where supply equals demand? So where S1 equals D1, we can see that P4, whatever variable that is, would be our price equilibrium or equilibrium price. In addition, they might ask you, what is the equilibrium quantity, right? This is where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded in the free market. And we're going to take a look at where S1 equals D1, and that intersection illustrates that quantity 1 is the equilibrium quantity, all right? So the equilibrium quantity is at quantity 1, all right? The free market where the S1 equals the D1, where the free market supply equals the free market demand. In addition, they might ask you, what is the consumer and producer surplus in the free market? All right, so here we'll put free market, consumer surplus. I'll just put CS for short, consumer surplus. And what is that equal to? I will highlight that area in blue. So we want to follow our demand curve up to the free market equilibrium price, and that will illustrate what area we should be calculating, all right? What a consumer is willing to pay versus what they actually pay, what they're willing to pay versus what they actually pay. So that kind of represents the level of savings among households. So consumer surplus in the free market is equal to areas A plus B, which is equal to the height, in this case, the variable of P6 minus P4. So P6 minus P4 will give us the height multiplied by the base. So in this case, quantity 1 minus 0, or just quantity 1. And all of that divided by 2, all right, since it's a triangle. Okay, great. In addition, they might ask you to calculate the producer surplus in the free market. So let's illustrate that area. And here we want to follow our supply curve, S1, up to the free market equilibrium price, in this case P4, and that will illustrate the producer surplus. So the cost of producing this quantity versus the price received by the firm, the cost of producing this quantity versus the price received by the firm. So the producer surplus kind of illustrates the profit to the firm, or in this case, farmers that produce corn. So the producer surplus, PS for short, is equal to areas G plus H. And that's going to be equal to this height multiplied by the base divided by 2. So that's going to be the variable of P4 minus P2 multiplied by the base of Q1 minus 0, or just Q1. And all of that divided by 2, and that will give us this producer surplus. Okay. Now let's look at social surplus. That can be asked as well. Social surplus, we want to remember, is equal to the sum of consumer surplus plus the producer surplus in the free market in this case. And that's all equal to, put that in parentheses, areas A, B, G, and H. So areas A plus B plus G plus H in this particular model. And that would be equal to this entire height multiplied by the base divided by 2. So that is going to be in the variables of P6 minus P2, whatever price that is on the graph that you're given, multiplied by the height, the base, Q1 minus 0, and all of that divided by 2, and that will give us the surface area of this larger triangle. Or you can just add up the consumer surplus and producer surplus if you have already calculated that. Great. Now, in the free market where S1 equals D1, we want to remember that the supply curve is equal to our marginal cost and our demand curve is equal to our marginal benefit. So in the free market where S1 equals D1, we see that the marginal costs of production are equal to the marginal benefit to the household, or in this case, to the firm that's consuming the input. Thus, it is allocatively efficient. All right, we're producing the combination of inputs in this case that are desired by society. So it's allocatively efficient, and thus there is no welfare loss. All right, we are not wasting any of our scarce resources in this theoretical model. Then on an exam, after calculating this, you might be asked to go on and illustrate the effect of a subsidy. They might give you an amount to which the subsidy is provided to the firm per unit, and thus you want to graph the supply curve shifting out by that amount. So distance between here and here should be the quantity of the subsidy being provided to firms. Well, actually not the quantity, but the price, right, being provided to firms per quantity. So we want to make sure that the distance between here and here is the size of the subsidy, right? And it will cause a parallel shift outward or downward by that amount, right? So we can imagine the supply curve shifting out by that amount or shifting downward by that amount. So the distance between here and here, in theory, should be equal to the distance between here and here. Okay, so you will take your ruler and carefully draw that. You'll probably have the graph given to you on grid paper. And once you've established that new supply curve, then you'll pay attention to where the S2 equals D1, and then you'll draw the new equilibrium price at P3 and the new equilibrium quantity with the subsidy at Q2, and then you will go on to make a few other calculations. So that can include the market, let's say market with the subsidy. They might ask you, what is the price paid by consumers? So I'll label that PC, so for price paid by the consumer, and that will be equal to price of P3, all right, whatever that variable is on your graph. Then they might ask you, what is the new quantity with the subsidy? So the quantity with the subsidy, all right, again, we're looking where S2 equals D1, and we see that's equal to Q2, whatever variable that is on your graph. And they might ask you, what is the price received by the producer? So that's going to be equal to the price paid by the consumer plus the subsidy. All right, the price paid by the consumer plus the subsidy. All right, P3 plus subsidy gives us P5. And that's going to be equal to the variable of P5. All right. Some other questions can include consumer spending and total revenue before and after. So some notes about that. Let's look at total revenue. All right, and just a note about before the subsidy. total revenue 1, all right, before subsidy, I'll call that total revenue 1, or maybe to clarify this, all right, before the subsidy, the original total revenue 1, it's going to be equal to P4 times Q1, right? P4 times Q1, right? This rectangular area. And then with the subsidy, total revenue with the subsidy is now equal to the higher price received by the firm, P5, times the increased quantity being supplied. So P5 times Q2. All right, and we can see that the total revenue with the subsidy for the firm is greater than what it was in the free market. And then we can calculate what the change is. Total revenue 2 minus total revenue 1 to see the increase in the level of total revenue to the firm. All right, that could be an additional question. What is the change? All right, and that would be the final value minus the initial value. So in this case, total revenue 2 minus total revenue 1 would give us that change. Next, consumer spending. All right, consumer expenditure could be other calculations being made. Expenditure being another word for spending. And then before the subsidy, again in the free market, consumer spending was price paid by the consumer multiplied by a number of units consumed by the household, or in this case, the firm that is demanding the input. And that's going to be P4 times Q1, which is the same as the total revenue for the producer. And then after the subsidy, consumers pay a lower price, P3, but they consume more units at Q2. So we want to see that consumer spending is at a price of P3 multiplied by a greater quantity being consumed at Q2. All right, so this area was the original, and then we see that the price has fallen for the consumer, and so it becomes P3 times Q2. Okay, great. And again, they might ask you, what's the change, right? What is the change in consumer spending? So we want to be taking our final value, which is the amount that's calculated with the subsidy, minus the initial, which is the amount before the subsidy, or the amount in the free market. Great. Moving on, other calculations, looking at the consumer surplus with the subsidy and the producer surplus with the subsidy. So now looking at the market with the subsidy, calculating the consumer surplus. So consumer surplus with the subsidy is going to be equal to, and we want to see that here we have the consumers, and they are consuming along the demand curve. Thanks to the subsidy, the price has fallen to P3. So this will represent the level of consumer surplus, or kind of savings, right? Increased amount. So that's going to be equal to areas A plus B plus G plus F plus E. And that will be equal to this new height, in this case of P6 minus P3, right? The value of P6 minus P3 multiplied by the height. I'm sorry, by the base. Q2 minus 0, right? Q2 minus 0, just Q2. And all of that divided by 2 would give us the consumer surplus. And you might be asked to calculate the change. What's the difference between the consumer surplus with the subsidy versus the consumer surplus without the subsidy? So you'll just subtract those two values, right? Keeping in mind that you want to look at the final minus the initial to see if it is rising or falling. And in this case, we'll see that the consumer surplus is increasing. Right? There's a greater amount. We can state by how much more it has increased. Right? The consumer surplus with the subsidy. I'll just make a note there. Okay. Next, how about the producer surplus? Producer surplus with the subsidy is going to be equal to, we're going to follow our supply curve up to the new price received by the producer at P5. And this becomes the triangular area that we're now calculating. So that is going to be equal to areas B plus C plus G plus H. And that's going to be equal to this height, P5, minus P2, multiplied by this base of Q2 minus 0, which is Q2, divided by 2. And that will give us this triangular area. And again, if you're asked to calculate the change between the producer surplus before and after the subsidy, you want to take the final value, that's the producer surplus with the subsidy, minus the initial value, which is producer surplus without the subsidy. And that change will tell us by how much producer surplus has increased by, in this case, by areas B and C. What else can you be asked to calculate? Well, how much is the government spending on this subsidy? Right? So government spending, right, to provide the subsidy. So tax revenue gained by the government is now being used on the provision of the subsidy. So tax revenue spent by the government on the provision of this subsidy to corn farmers in this case, right? So you might be asked, how much money is the government spending, or how much tax revenue is being spent by the government in providing this subsidy? So that will be areas, let's use green. Here is the subsidy, right? We want to see that the price received by the producer has increased, the price paid by the consumer has decreased. The distance between P5 and P3 is the amount of subsidy for each unit. So again, let's highlight this, and that will be this rectangular area representing the amount of money being spent by the government in providing this subsidy. So it's this entire green area. Okay, so the price for each bushel, in this case, multiplied by a number of bushels being produced by the farmer, and that's the amount of money that's being spent. So that will be equal to areas B plus C plus D plus E plus F plus G, and that's going to be equal to the subsidy itself, which is P5 minus P3, multiplied by the base, Q2 minus 0, and all of that divided, I'm sorry, no division, right, because this is a rectangle. Okay, so that is that area, P5 minus P3, multiplied by a number of units, all right, and it gives us that surface area, that rectangle. When the government spends that amount, some students might be a little bit confused by this government spending. Imagine it as a layer on top of your graph. And from this layer that's being provided by the government, a slice is being cut and being given. So from this layer that is being spent by the government, the slice of G, F, and E is being given to the producers. All right, so the slice of G, F, and E, this slice is being given to the producers. And then the slice, oops, sorry, my mistake. the slice of G, F, and E is being given to the household or the firm demanding the input. So this is going to the consumer. And then the slice of B and C, right, that is going to the farmer or producer in this case. So the government spends all of this money, and areas B and C as a slice being cut is given to the producer, and areas E, F, and G as a slice is being given to the consumer or the firm demanding this input. So there is some waste here, all right? There's an area that is wasted, some spending by the government which is wasted, which is area D. And area D represents the welfare loss. All right, just highlighting that there. So this would probably be one of the last things you'd be calculating or asked to calculate. What is the welfare loss? And we want to remember that in this case, the subsidy has generated an overallocation of resources. We can see that at Q2, the marginal cost of production is greater than the marginal benefit, right? The marginal cost along the supply curve greater than the demand. So at Q2, we notice that the marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit, which means that there's an over allocation, right? We're providing too many resources to the production and consumption of corn, which is not really desired by society. Society doesn't need this quantity of corn, so it's generating a level of waste. And thus there's a welfare loss generated by area D. And area D would be equal to, if we were to calculate that, this height multiplied by this base divided by 2. So the height is going to be P5 minus P3 multiplied by the base of Q2 minus Q1, Q2 minus Q1, right? So the distance between here and here, and then all of that divided by 2 because it is a triangle, and then we have calculated the level of spending that has been wasted by the government in producing too much of something versus what is desired by society. All right, and that's it. So those are our calculations for a subsidy graph. If you have any questions, feel free to comment, and don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.